America has spoken. The 2024 presidential election, one of the most chaotic cycles in American history, is in the books. I'm going to sit down with our Dylan Nolan, who's been tracking this race with me from the beginning, to walk through all the big developments that led us to a decisive outcome on Election Day and what happens next as a second Trump presidency is set to begin. I'm also going to sit down with our Callie Lyons and Jen Wood to talk about big developments in the case of John Paul Miller, an FBI raid, protesters stalking and allegedly harassing Miller, and Miller himself getting arrested. All of that and more is heading your way on the Week in Review. What was billed as, and what may have been, America's most consequential presidential election is in the books. Former U.S. President Donald Trump emerged the victor in a sweeping popular vote and electoral victory. In fact, the electoral vote, a landslide, as Trump won all 7 swing states or battlegrounds, 6 of which he lost during the 2020 presidential election. I'm joined by Dylan Nolan as we go back over what was an election unlike any other. But the election night, Dylan, contrary to a lot of predictions, we found out pretty soon who won. The margins were sufficient that there were really no need to dive into legal challenges. Let me ask you this. First of all, are you surprised that we're sitting here talking on this show with a known winner, with a concession, and with a transition already underway?
I'm not surprised because some of the pollsters, one of whom we had in our studio, who have a history of being reputable in their ability to accurately predict the outcome of elections, especially with Trump on the ballot, told us that this was a likely outcome.
Just 3 days before the pivotal voting, we had Robert Cahaley, one of the best pollsters in the country, in this studio, who was telling us, as you mentioned, that this was in fact not a possibility, but from his vantage point, a probability. Let's actually cut to his take here, Dylan, him talking about that hidden Trump vote.
So many Republicans who are for Trump are afraid of being kept track of. They ask, who are you doing this for? Who gets this information? Where does
They
it
say
go?
that to your pollsters.
Yeah. Where does it go? Or they're replying a text or an email. Where does this go? Who sees this?
Oh, wow.
And literally questions like, well, where do you house this stuff? I mean, is it on Google Cloud? I mean, they want to know everything, and it's like they're nervous. They're extremely nervous.
All right, so Dylan, Robert Cahaley talking about the Trump voters who would not say on polls that they were supporting the president, but came to the ballot box in force on Tuesday. Let me ask you this. Were the polls right this time? We've talked about the polls being so far off the mark in 2016 and 2020. Did they get it right this time?
This was certainly the closest they've ever been with Trump on the ballot. They were predicting that every one of these swing states would be on a knife's edge. And I'm looking at an aggregate of polling here, including people like Trafalgar, but also including people who are inclined to go the other direction. And, you pointed off that they were around 2 points off in a lot of these states, but your margin of error on these polls is oftentimes larger than 2%. So while no, they were not right, I mean, look, we've been saying for months, if Trump performs as the polls say he's going to perform, he will win. And Trump performed within the margin of error of the polls, and he won. So I wouldn't say that this is like 2016 or even like 2020, where we're left scratching our heads as to what methodologies the pollsters were using to arrive at the data that they presented to the public.
That's true. I would point out, however, that even the pollsters that were more accurately reflecting that hidden Trump vote, whether it's Trafalgar, Atlas Intel, Rasmussen, not even those guys had the margin quite as far in Trump's favor as it ultimately wound up being. I also want to talk about one poll. Just days before the vote, Iowa pollster Ann Selzer predicted that Kamala Harris would win the state of Iowa by 3 percentage points. This was a poll that really galvanized Democrats. They'd been sweating this thing a little bit, Dylan, but all of a sudden they thought, oh, wait a minute, not only the swing states are in play for us, Iowa is potentially on the table. In fact, we heard the day of the election, NBC touting Democrat hope in Florida, in Ohio, all over the map, in Texas. These were states, though, Dylan. Let's go through the map here. Iowa went to Trump by 13. Florida was a rout. Texas was a rout. Ohio was a rout. Double-digit victories for Trump in all of those states. So obviously that was one poll that missed.
Yeah, and to play devil's advocate on this, the Republicans were talking a big game in Virginia, and the state still went blue. But I mean, let's not lie. Virginia moved rightwards. And that Iowa poll was just completely off the mark, to the point where I wonder if she was kind of taking one for the team as a partisan and throwing away some of her credibility just to try to get some enthusiasm bump going right into the election. Because I mean, she has a reputation as a good pollster, and I've heard that from people on the right and people on the left who say that they've used her information to make decisions. So for somebody like that to be so wrong indicates that she probably did it knowing what she was doing.
Yeah, it's a 16 percentage point miss. That's a
That's a
huge
massive
miss.
miss. That's not something that you do if you're a professional.
Let me ask you though. You mentioned Virginia, a state that Trump was more competitive in than many expected him to be. I want to ask you about this. Virginia has same-day voter registration. Wisconsin also has same-day voter registration. The only state on my map that I was a little bit leery about putting in the Trump column was Wisconsin. I ended up doing it anyway. Really banking on Cahaley's wisdom on that. But Wisconsin is another state with same-day registration. Dylan, I keep hearing from folks that the same-day registration, which was pushed by Democrats, one of their key get out the vote efforts, worked against them this time. Are you hearing the same thing?
Yeah, we're in this strange period of political realignment where the Democrat Party, which had been the blue collar everyman party, is suddenly becoming the party of the college educated elite and a shrinking number of minority groups. Um, and that means that their strategies, which were tuned to enable them to capture as much of that blue collar vote as possible, are suddenly backfiring on them. And it's funny because the importation of a ton of people from South America who they thought would be a lock to vote for them forever, it's the same thing. It's turning right around, and it's helping the Republican Party now.
Well, and it was a circular firing squad on a lot of these far left talk shows the day after the election. They're blaming Hispanics for being racist, black men for being racist against black women. It was a
And I think that's just ridiculous. I think that these people, regardless of their race, want to have a better future and see that there's things in the Democrat Party they don't like. And I think that no matter how you feel, I don't judge anybody. If they want to be Democrat, be a Democrat. But they need to have a moment of introspection here where they say, we were the party that was going really hard against people if they didn't want to get an experimental, and that's what it was, COVID vaccine. They didn't have enough time on the market. It still doesn't have enough time for people to truly know what the long-term health ramifications are. What folks need to understand is mRNA technology is completely different than every other vaccine that we've now had decades to show what the effects are. And they were the party who pushed really tyrannical measures on that. They were the party who pushed lawfare in a way that's never happened before in America. And yet they're now reflecting on, oh, this is the fault of black men. This is the fault of Latinos. No, it's the fault of doing things which, and of course the economy. Uh, it's the fault of those policies. That's what drove those people away.
Well, I agree with you on that. I think the economic angle was big. In fact, when I was discussing my map before the results came in and justifying it, my argument was that, a lot of fringe issues moved a lot of people, whether it's the trans issue and immigration on the right, whether it was abortion on the left. A lot of those issues galvanized the base, but when undecided, it's that small sliver of the electorate that decided this race in those 7 swing states. I'm convinced they went in there and thought to themselves, wait a minute, was I better 4 years ago? And will I be better in 4 years under Kamala Harris? I think they overwhelmingly said no.
And this is what we call in politics the fundamentals of the race. And the fundamentals of the race were that 78% of Americans, when polled, said that they think America is going in the wrong direction. Kamala Harris failed to articulate why she would reverse what Americans believe was the country going in the wrong direction.
Well, let me ask you this. You said earlier, be a Democrat if you want to be a Democrat. Let's talk, though, about what does that mean? Because obviously John F. Kennedy was a Democrat who wanted to cut taxes, empower the economy by small business growth, giving people more of their money. He would be a right-wing MAGA in this election. You also referenced Donald Trump as a 90s Democrat that, the Overton window has kind of moved him into Republican camp. But let me ask you this. Kamala Harris and the voters that she was trying to get, they weren't even really Joe Biden Democrats, because Biden had a kind of everyman appeal, at least in his first race, that resonated with some of those blue-collar working class male voters. Kamala didn't have that.
We talk oftentimes about whether a politician is playing a game of addition or playing a game of subtraction. And Joe Biden was playing a game of addition. He welcomed in the more radical left-wing side of the party, and you can see they were the ones who made his agenda. And that was kind of the price of them getting on board with his presidency. And that drove him to the White House. But Harris, I think, played a game of subtraction in that she said, she didn't put enough energy into appealing to the part of Biden's base that she most needed to, which were those white working class voters who I believe rightly feel that the Democrat Party has abandoned their interests.
Yeah. Well, and of course, micro factors in this race, whether you look at the Islamic vote in Michigan, we got to look at exit polls and see where we're at with that. Obviously, the Amish vote in Pennsylvania came through for Trump. So there were some micro factors going. Also, her vice presidential choice. I think a lot of folks believe had she picked the governor of Pennsylvania, maybe things would have been different. She obviously didn't want to offend that Palestinian.
I don't think that changes the fundamentals of the race.
Yeah.
And I think Shapiro made a good choice by keeping his powder dry because I think that he has a really bright future in the party, assuming they don't go full anti-Semite in the long term. I mean, he's a really smart and adept politician. And that was kind of what you're hearing is that he might not have actually wanted to get onto the sinking ship.
Oh, wow.
And I think that's why a guy like Newsom pulled his name out of consideration for the nomination so soon. I think people saw the fundamentals of this race. How do you turn that around? Even if you're a competent politician, it's hard to row up river.
Yeah. Well, and the economic river certainly rowing against the incumbent. But let me ask you this, Dylan. Is Trump now the dog that's caught the car as it relates to the economy? I mean, we're looking at some decent holiday spending forecasts.
Yep.
Obviously, there was a rate cut in the immediate aftermath of the election, a smaller rate cut than the one before the election. But let me ask you this. There was some testiness between Fed Chairman Jerome Powell and reporters. They asked him, do you expect Trump to seek your removal? He said, no. Can Trump remove you if he wants to? He said, no.
Here's who can remove him: Congress. They were the ones who created the independent Federal Reserve, and they're the ones who can end the independent Federal Reserve. I think there's a lot of smart people who make smart arguments that much of the economic woes and the outflow of capital from America to other parts of the world that we've seen in the last 100 years are a direct result of our banking system. Trump has not indicated that he wants to end the Federal Reserve, but Jerome Powell talking tough is certainly interesting. He is most certainly statutorily enabled to talk as tough as he wants because the president can't really do much about it. But as Americans, it would be very interesting to me to see if this becomes a policy discussion in the future and if this is something that folks who want to become congressmen or senators are asked about when they're running for office.
Well, let's talk about it, though, now, the policy side of this, because, we've got another real estate bubble. We've got
Yep.
We've college loan debt. We've got government debt.
A lot of debt in this nation, personal debt.
Personal debt. There's a bubble. There's clearly a bubble. And is it poised to pop in a Trump first term? And if it does pop, what are the implications? Can Trump do anything to mitigate those after effects?
Oh, yes. Trump has a lot of power as the executive of the United States to mitigate those. And of course, as we say, the central bank will do what the central bank will do, which I believe will be to cut interest rates back down to rock bottom. So if you're like me and you're kind of wondering, okay, when am I going to buy a house? You're a young adult. That's something you're looking forward to. Nobody's really loving these close to 10% interest rates. But what will Trump be able to do? I think his policy with tariffs, if he carries through what he says he's going to do, has the ability to bring massive amounts of cash back into the United States, force businesses to invest in the United States, or just make it profitable for them to invest in the United States. And that's a economic lever that the free market types that have, dominated the economic theory of both the left and the right for the last couple of decades have not really been willing to consider doing, because the basis of America's ability to project its power abroad is our willingness to participate in free trade with allied nations. But he's taking that off the table in a way, or at least saying, look, you got to quid pro quo, make sure that we're getting our fair share here. So if he's willing to use that mechanism of leverage, he might be able to have economic impacts in a recession scenario that we're not used to American presidents being able to do.
Obviously, economic challenges lurk ahead for Trump in his second term, but also there is the ongoing nature of the swamp, which we've seen in many occasions in the past. When George W. Bush took office with a Republican House and Republican Senate. Trump has a Republican Senate. He's likely going to have a Republican House, as he did during the first 2 years of his
What'd that
first
get us?
term. Yeah, what did that get us? And so here's my question. Obviously, FITSNews very critical of Trump during his first term on fiscal policy. We are now in a situation because he didn't listen, because Biden and Obama didn't listen, because Bush didn't listen. We are now in a situation where the national debt, again, 36 trillion, interest payments on it over $1 trillion a year we're looking at now.
Untenable.
Yeah. So how does a Republican government address that and grow an economy in light of that kind of a challenge?
It's interesting. I think your classic conservative argument would be to find some XYZ budget item and cut it. Trump's argument is he doesn't want to cut anything. And I understand. He's got elections to win. Cutting things, especially money that senior citizens, people, rely on, that's had to lose in a landslide. And that's why they say democracies will vote themselves into insolvency. And I think there's some truth to that. But Trump's economic plan, as he's articulated it on the campaign trail, has been to increase government revenues by increasing the output of the economy. And he did in the first half of his administration show, as you say, with little help from Congress, that he knew how to leverage the power of the executive to grow the economy. And his argument was that net increase of cash influx to the government, had there not been COVID, would have resulted in him being able to pay off debt in the second half of his first term. Well, I don't know if that's true, but he's going to be the president again. He's going to have the ability to try to implement his agenda again. And now he has a mandate, so he will have even more power to actually carry this out. So who knows? In 4 years, maybe our national debt will be higher and we'll both be saying, well, Trump was full of shit twice. But this is his opportunity to prove if he's serious about this issue.
Well, I certainly appreciate the fact we've got Elon Musk and Ron Paul looking at the kicking the tires and looking for ways to say that is a extremely positive development for those of us limited government advocates who believe that the size and scope of the federal government is out of control. But again, the problem I see...
Elon Musk is the king of government subsidies. Come on now. He's not a limited government guy.
Well, he better find some stuff to cut. But here's the problem. No matter what that Department of Government Efficiency comes up with, there's only so much you can cut from the bureaucratic machine. The entitlements are the real problem. That's the driver of those massive deficits that we're seeing. And Trump has vowed not to touch those entitlements. I do want to say a couple of things here. Obviously, this media outlet more favorable to the policies that Trump has advanced on the whole, more critical of the communist price control type policies that the left advanced economically. But something needs to be said about, in this race, one of the few candidates that spoke truth to power on entitlements was Nikki Haley. Now, Nikki Haley obviously has zero future in the Republican Party, and I'm okay with that. Not for my personal history with the former governor, but just simply because I think her neocon angle is not something that America needs. I don't think it's healthy for this country, but she was speaking the truth on entitlements, Dylan.
You say she has no future in the Republican Party. I wouldn't be surprised if she figures a way to weasel herself into this administration and then runs for president again and has serious backing.
Well,
I don't know that saying she has no future in the Republican Party. I think that's short-sighted there, Will.
well, we'll see. I think she's in a very difficult spot because
What do you think? These neocons are going to evaporate? I mean, people are going to be running for office again in what will feel like 18 months.
I don't think they're going to evaporate, Dylan, but I think the control they once held over the electorate is done.
And this is what we had discussed on air on election night, is that this election is much more than about the next 4 years. This is about baking the MAGA realignment of the Republican Party's values away from free trade, away from interventionism, into the DNA of the Republican Party, and making it so that the next primary cycle, somebody like Nikki Haley is going to have a lot harder of a time than she had this time, where she still got smoked.
Well, and your crystal ball has been better than mine leading up to this race, but I'm going to go ahead and put it out there. More difficult? No, I think it's impossible. I think she's done. And I think that's a good thing for the party. But she was right on entitlements. Moving on to another person that I think we rarely credit, but I'm going to go ahead and throw this out there. The rhetoric from Kamala Harris in the weeks leading up to this day of decision, particularly in the last few weeks, was awful, dangerous, I would argue. In fact, we're dealing with a guy who was nearly assassinated not once but twice, and they're throwing the literally Hitler card in the last weeks of election. I think it's shameful. I will say this, though. In the aftermath of what was a clear defeat, And again, you were going to say, what the hell else was she supposed to say but concede gracefully? I would argue, you know what? Some of the supporters of that campaign are so unhinged, as we've seen on social, as we've seen on the streets of Chicago, as we're going to probably continue to see the closer we get to Inauguration Day. I have to give her credit for doing the honorable thing, conceding the race gracefully, and Biden for promising a peaceful transition of power. I mean, these are things that in years past we've just accepted. We've accepted as the way things are going to go, but nothing's sure these days. So, Dylan, your thoughts on her conceding gracefully?
Well, you've given her credit, so it's been given. But I will say that Joe Biden looked the happiest that I've seen him throughout the last 4 years. I mean, seriously, look at this picture. You can't tell me this man was not thrilled. You can't tell me that he did not vote for Donald Trump. He
Oh
snubbed her
yeah.
at her own party. And you know what? She looked relieved when she was giving that speech. And it was one of the better speeches that both of them have delivered in the last 18 months. I mean, it's shocking that they're delivering some of their best speeches after they got their clocks cleaned. Like, did they not want to win?
Well, some of the reports that we were reading out of the White House from those Beltway publications talking about Jill Biden beaming in the White House the day after the election. And of course, Jill Biden on the day of the vote showed up to vote in Delaware wearing some bright
MAGA hat red,
red
baby.
colors.
You can't make this election cycle up. I mean, this feels like something out of a movie.
Dylan, looking back on this cycle, I think one of the biggest impacts was Elon Musk purchasing X and that platform becoming not only a vibrant, robust marketplace for the first time in a long time, but having a real impact on countering the misinformation from the mainstream press. It's so funny, you've got these status quo media elites touting disinformation, yet they're the ones selectively editing interviews with Kamala Harris and putting out pure fiction. And it was X that was there every step of the way to really counter those institutional misinformation campaigns.
Yeah, and that was something that the Republicans certainly lacked in 2020. And I think that, once again, let's go back to COVID. Whatever, you can win an election, you can lose an election. But what happened during COVID, I think, really showed the need to have a channel for distributing true information that is not the mainstream media. And that's something that can't be bought and controlled by big corporate interests, as the mainstream media has proven they're beholden to big pharma.
Well, a lot of those official narratives that in years past, as we talked about, really drove the debate, shaped public opinion, influenced
Like a
those.
snowman in a sauna, they melted away.
That's right. That's right. And good for us, good for outlets like ours.
And I like to encourage, folks, as you say, we have our political views, but we try to be objective in our analysis of pretty much everything. If you want somebody for political coverage, feel free to follow me over on X, dnolan2000. I don't plug myself very much, but I will say that if Trump does things well, we'll credit him for it. If he makes America stronger and better and improves things, we'll credit him. If he makes us broker and less safe and he's screwing up, we're going to call him out for it. But we're not going to be hysterical in either direction. FITSNews, at FITSNews on X, at dnolan2000 for me personally. If you just want some media coverage for the next 4 years, that's not going to be the absolute lunacy that the media did during his first administration, where they burned all their credibility to the ground, give us a follow. We're going to be even keeled. We're going to call balls and strikes, and that's what we're going to do for the next 4 years.
Well, we're going to hold this administration accountable to its promises. And I'll be honest, there was no tougher critic here in South Carolina of Trump during the first
No, you
term
busted him.
than us.
You earned your credibility as somebody who's willing to criticize Trump during his first administration, and I expect nothing less from you in this administration.
And I also want to point this out. I did take some grief from this from a lot of folks who are arguing, why didn't you endorse Trump in this cycle? Well, I said during the last one that based on his performance, particularly when he signed into law a COVID stimulus on the way out the door that he called a disgrace, I said, I'm not ever going to endorse the guy again. Did I vote for him this time over the option? Yes, I did. Yes, I did.
But did you endorse him? No, you stuck to with your word.
No, and again, I was a Joe Jorgensen guy last time. Libertarians put forward a good candidate last time. They put forward a terrible candidate this time,
Well,
which I
and a
think helped
Clemson
Trump.
professor. That's pretty cool.
Yeah,
As a South Carolinian.
Joe Jorgensen was great. I hope voices like hers and Ron Paul's are heeded in this administration. But Dylan, talking about this election, there's one chart that I think we've got to discuss, and I think we've got to entertain this because for so long, I would look at these numbers and think I was having a tinfoil hat moment. But we've got a chart here we're going to pull up. and this is just stunning. We're talking about millions of Democratic voters, purported Democratic voters, who vanished this cycle. This is the one chart that to me is, again, if not evidence of a stolen election, certainly an indicator that we need to look into that possibility, or at least be
And
accepting
for
that.
folks who are just listening, basically what this chart is illustrating is the last 4 or 5 presidential elections. You see the Democrats turn within 5 million votes of what they did the previous election every cycle. But then in 2020, 14 million voters who had never been there before and did not vote this cycle appeared out of thin air, seemingly, to vote for Joe Biden. And who knows where the heck they are. But the Democrats had a really hard time rebuilding that coalition because no longer is it COVID where they could kick poll watchers out and do whatever the heck they did in 2020. No, like there are legal rights for attorneys from both political parties to observe the process, and the lack of the COVID excuse meant that they could not pull off whatever the heck it was they did in 2020. And you're kind of you're not on the fence here, but I'm willing to say after looking at this that there was something that went horribly wrong in 2020, and that the United States court system, uh, in failing to let Trump's attorneys even present their case because they were ruled in every court did not have standing, clearly that was an injustice, and they should have at least let the Trump team present their case. Even if they didn't win their cases, they should not have ruled that they did not have standing. They should have let them present their case.
But how much of that mass, and for those of you again watching, what we're looking at is a massive blue bar from 2020 that eclipsed all the blue bars before it and dramatically eclipsed the blue bar from this election.
Harris returned to the mean. She didn't underperform what they're used to getting. It's just that in 2020 they did something completely anomalous.
Well, let me ask you about that anomaly, though. We talked to a number of political strategists here in South Carolina about districts that were heavy Black voting age population districts, or BVAP districts. These are districts where the percentage of the population that is voting age, the Black population is 38%, 40%, very high. And these are districts where Republicans just aren't competitive historically, where they never win. They won 4 of them in the South Carolina Senate here in South Carolina. And I want to ask you, Dylan, as we look at that crazy blue bar that is so, such an anomaly, can some of that be Black male voters in particular that were with the Biden ticket that turned out for Trump in record numbers? How much of that is just a shift from blue to red, not a phantom blue vote?
I don't know. I don't even know why you're asking me. How the heck could I even know that? It's clearly some
What
of
do you
both of
think,
these
man?
things.
Come on.
You're asking me for a number. Look, we were never allowed to investigate this
Yeah.
in a scientific way in courts of law. Attorneys should have been able to present this stuff so that we could have it on the record, so that you could ask me a question like this, and I could have an answer that actually has some numbers. But we won't know. And at this point, it's water under the bridge. But that should have been allowed to have been addressed when it was irrelevant.
Let me ask it this way. How do you think Trump did with Black voters this cycle?
I mean, the numbers don't lie. He did better than any Republican candidate has ever done.
Well, obviously, breaking down these demographic trends is what we do here. The months leading up to this election, we analyze them. Now, obviously, our focus, Dylan, will be shifting to Trump's second term, what he hopes to accomplish, how he hopes to get it done, and again, those huge issues he's inheriting economically. And obviously, we talked a little bit about neocons and foreign policy, but there are a few global hotspots flaring up as well, Dylan.
Indeed, I don't think there's going to be any shortage of stuff for us to cover here. I would like to return to what I was saying before, in that we promise to do this in a way that's objective. We have our political leanings. We're open about that. But we're going to hold the Trump administration to just as much account as we would hold a Democrat administration. We welcome people with guest columns that are negative, with people who don't like Donald Trump to submit guest columns to our website. We'll run them up on the front of the website, just like we run our own pieces. So folks, we're going to try to be objective. We're going to try to be rational, and we hope that throughout this presidency, you'll join us and allow us to deliver you news coverage of what goes on.
Absolutely. During our election night coverage, for those of you who turned in, we talked a lot about these open microphones here at FITSNews. That is the key to what we do here. As Dylan said, we've got our perspectives. We've got our takes on things. We're not shy about sharing them, but we always turn these mics open to those with divergent, counter, dissenting views, because again, we believe here in a lot of things, but above all, we believe in the marketplace of ideas. So for political coverage that doesn't follow the MSM line, that allows for that independent, critical thinking, keep it tuned to FITSNews. So if you thought it was a big week in American politics, it was an even bigger week in the saga of Micah Miller. Major developments. In fact, as we were going live during last week's Month in Review, news broke out of Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, that the Federal Bureau of Investigation was searching the home of Pastor John Paul Miller. Miller, of course, announcing his wife's tragic death back in the spring of this year, the day after she died, announcing it to his flock at the Solid Rock at Market Common Church there in Myrtle Beach. The way he announced this, though, really stoked all manner of suspicion. He told congregants not to talk about it as they left the church. He also basically gaslit his own late wife in that sermon, that bizarre sermon the day after Micah's death. Once we reported on it, this story took on a life of its own, folks. It has attracted international attention, and the raid, or search rather, of John Paul Miller's Myrtle Beach home dominating this story last week. I want to bring Jen Wood and Callie Lyons in now to talk about these seismic developments in the J.P. Miller case. Callie, let me start with you. As we've been looking at this story, you've been doing a ton of reporting on not only John Paul Miller and the moves he's making behind the scenes, but also diving deep into the history of his father, the Reverend Reginald Wayne Miller, who has quite a colorful history of his own. Jen, you've been doing a lot of work on these two as well. But Callie, let me start with you. Where is this story going based on this raid? Do we feel like John Paul Miller is the only target here?
It's doubtful that John Paul is the only target in this investigation. We've seen a pattern of behavior that goes back to the 80s involving his father, the Reverend Reginald Wayne Miller. So it seems very likely that he too is going to be under investigation.
Now, Jen, let me ask you, the subject of this investigation, so far we don't know a lot of it. Some folks have speculated that the feds are investigating him for Micah's murder, speculating that Micah was murdered. Obviously, that would be inconsistent with what law enforcement has concluded, with what medical examiners have concluded. Certainly, those theories we need to be skeptical of, but as of right now, that's the narrative. But we have heard that it's not a murder investigation, but that it is focused on allegations of interstate domestic violence. Jen, tell us a little bit about what we know about the focus of the federal investigation right now.
Yeah, so right. I mean, we don't know a lot, but our sources did indicate it was related to allegations of interstate domestic violence, which is interesting given that Micah did die across state lines in a state park in North Carolina. So whether or not it's tied to her death, we don't know yet, but that stuck out to me.
Well, Callie, you've been holding some conversations with some folks that are very close to this, who've been investigating this from the beginning. We, in fact, as a group, spoke with Robbie Harvey the other day. We're going to get into that in a minute. But before we do, I wanted to ask you, Callie, looking at what we know of Micah's death and the suspicion surrounding it, and those who have maintained from the beginning that it is not suicide, who have pointed the finger at JP. Let me ask you this. Is there anything that we should read into what the feds may have taken? Is there anything we should read into the questions that they are asking potential witnesses? Obviously, Regina Ward, Micah's attorney, came forward this week and confirmed now after the raid that she was in fact subpoenaed by a federal grand jury. I mean, Callie, what kind of tea leaves can we deduce from some of these developments?
It seems to me that the feds have cast a very wide net. They are still seeing victims come forward and seem to be talking to anyone and everyone who is willing to share information with them. So at this point, I think it's a little too early to say.
Well, Jen, you sat down with Regina Ward this week. What did she have to say about these developments?
She was very pleased with the developments. I think like everybody, everybody's been very impatient, wondering what's going to happen, having questions about the investigation. But federal investigations are not overnight, and she said she was very pleased that the search had occurred because it's indicative that the investigation is progressing nicely.
When you've got a clip from that conversation, if I'm not mistaken, Jen, walk us through what we're about to watch.
So yeah, this is a clip talking about Regina's take on this search and what it means, and where she thinks that this what the next steps could be.
Let's take a listen.
I know that some people, in the community, supporters and, so forth, or concerned, saying this is taking way too long. In fact, I think that, maybe some people were starting to lose faith that something was actually happening. Of course, the FBI would not be able to give me the date that this was going to happen, obviously. But I was hoping that it wasn't too far on down the road. And I think that it came at such a great time. It's re-energized the interest of the public in the case, which at this point is super critical. There is a lot more work to be done. What's happened, obviously, in the beginning is the materials that were subpoenaed from me were the building blocks, and there was some particular evidence that the agents made known to me that they were very thrilled to have that I had presented to them. And so I was glad that we had some things that was enough for them to, number one, open an investigation. Number two, for the United States Attorney's Office to take up an interest and assign a case number to it. Then taking all that information would go to the next step, which was, getting enough to show that there was probable cause, i.e. more likely than not, that a crime, and of course I can't talk about what those may be, but more likely than not that a crime, has occurred. And so that gets it to the next level so that they can get to that search warrant. Now, the wonderful thing about that search warrant is once, the FBI has gone in and collected all the information from there, then it's expected in the normal course of how these types of things happen is that what we have already, or the FBI has already, and what they're adding to it as a result of that search warrant will add up to a nice level of an affidavit for a criminal indictment or indictments.
All right, Jen, coming out of that, she's talking about what's on the horizon, and walk us through this, because a lot of folks were very upset that John Paul wasn't escorted out in handcuffs after this federal search. That's not how it works, is it, Jen? Give us a little bit of a primer on this.
No, most people are used to watching, state level investigations where they make the arrest and then they start building the case from there. With the federal investigation, they are often investigating behind the scenes. And we know from Regina that she received that subpoena in June. So it was, I believe she said June 14th. So, at least as early as June 14th, the Federal Bureau investigation was involved in this investigation. So what they were doing, they were building their case and they had to come up with probable cause. And they submitted a probable cause affidavit for a search warrant to a federal magistrate. They clearly had enough because they signed off on it, and that led to that search. So for the federal investigators, their case is their case when they get to the indictment point, their case is in the bag. I mean, that's why federal cases move so quickly.
Right. So it'll be a while. And in fact, you were educating me the other day, for example, the search on Diddy was months before his arrest back in September. So it takes a while, and
Right.
they've got to go through what they obtain, match it with what they already know. So it takes some time. But
And my guess is there were, this is just an assumption, but there were electronic devices taken, and they've got to, go through the process of extracting the data from that and going through it as well.
So the criminal case against John Paul Miller is proceeding. The civil lawsuits that we know are coming against John Paul Miller, any idea on the status of those? Do you think those were maybe on hold because of all the criminal
We had gotten
progress?
gotten word that they were coming imminently. I think it was 2 weeks ago, and they did not. I think things kind of the trajectory shifted, and they kind of whatever civil attorneys were filing kind of had to step back for a second and wait for the status of this federal search.
And so we're tracking the civil developments. We're tracking the criminal investigation. Obviously, come next month in December of 2024, we will see pre-filing of bills in the South Carolina General Assembly. At that point, we will find out what level of legislative push there could be related to this. Again, obviously, there's been a lot of talk about it. We won't know until next month whether there will be bills introduced related to Micah's Law and some of the other issues that have been raised by the Justice for Micah crowd. We're going to see about that in the coming weeks. But also, Callie, you've been following a lot of the property records here and a lot of the incorporation moves that have been made in the background. Walk us through a little bit about what we've learned in the last week or so about what John Paul is doing behind the scenes with his incorporations.
Well, he has made some changes to his business filings, and I'd say the significant part of that was changing the address for Solid Rock to the actual address, which would seem to free him up to sell the property. He's also started a new entity called Living Water Church, and interestingly, that address is at his home.
So he's switching the names of the incorporations. He's apparently trying to sell this property too, as well.
That's right. He's trying to sell this property for as much as $3 million. Now, they obtained this property, his father specifically, obtained this property as Cathedral Baptist Church for $280,000.
And at the same time, these rumors of a potential sale of this property are coming out, Callie, we're hearing from folks at the church that no more services at Solid Rock, that the school there is shutting down. Those reports, Callie, to the best of your knowledge, are those accurate as well?
As far as we know, those are accurate. And of course, those reports drew quite the crowd to the grounds of Solid Rock this week. Onlookers and protesters were anxious to see the moving out of all of the furniture and the things inside the building. And the protests continue.
Well, speaking of those protesters, this was a hold your beer week in the Micah Miller story, because we had the federal raid, we had all these background moves being made, but there was an actual arrest this week. John Paul Miller was arrested this week in connection with an incident that took place with one of the protesters. And Jim, we've got it's a social clip here of the yelling and screaming. Let's watch this real quick. All right, guys, I'm watching this. I don't want to play the literal devil's advocate here, but I don't see anything here that would have given cause for John Paul Miller to be arrested. Unless we're missing something. I mean, maybe we are, but.
I mean, I think the third-degree assault and battery charge in South Carolina, just unwanted touch. So, I mean, seems silly, but he technically did break the law if he touched this person. But in terms of, I mean, just it's the protests have been a lot.
Well, you said the protests have been a lot, but expound on that. I mean, are these? I mean, I'm listening to that woman in the background on that last clip that she's clearly taunting and trolling them. I mean, understand that we all agree this is a bad dude, perhaps even a criminally bad dude on some very insidious levels. But is this sort of harassing type behavior, a little bit juvenile type behavior, is this really helping the Justice for Micah movement, or is it? I mean, I don't feel sympathy for him, but I could certainly see how this kind of stalking and getting arrested on such a tic tac kind of thing. I mean, I could see some people developing some sympathy for the guy. I mean, Callie, what do you think about all this? You think these protesters are going too far? Or?
Well, his attorney has said, Russell Long, who is John Paul's attorney, has said he's being relentlessly stalked and harassed by the protesters. I think it's important.
What's your thought on that?
Well, we need to consider what a peaceful protest is. And according to the ACLU of South Carolina, you're crossing the line and entering the realm of harassment if you're using offensive or derogatory language, if you're trespassing on private property, which church grounds would be, and you can't make unwelcome comments about a person's religion. So I think there's a thin line between what constitutes a peaceful protest and what could be construed as harassment.
I mean, because here's a problem. I mean, this is a guy who clearly nobody wants to rush to his defense on anything. In fact, I'm probably going to get trolled hard for just what I've said here. But I mean, at some point, are these folks less advancing Micah's narrative and more giving John Paul kind of a perch to stand on some of this stuff? Because again, I just don't see any reason why he should have been arrested in this case.
And I can get on board with the peaceful protest. I mean, you know me, I grew up in hippie town, and I can get on board with a peaceful protest 100%. I think protest matters, using your voice matters, but at some point, I think it's crossing the line into dangerous territory. I mean, we don't know what happened to Micah. We don't know, we don't know what led up to that. But from everything we know about John Paul, he's a little bit unpredictable. And at some point, it's time to let
snap.
The authorities step in and do their job, do their investigation, trust that there's going to be answers. And, I'd really love to see that the protest kind of move towards Micah's Law and, being proactive and going to the state house and, advocating for this legislation that's so important to this movement.
Yeah, let's consider how dangerous this person is. Not only do we have all of these allegations regarding Micah, but prior to that, many years ago, he was convicted of running a woman over with his truck. Now, he was later pardoned for that, but this is dangerous. People are putting themselves in harm's way if they are confronting or approaching. He can do this without provocation. We've seen evidence.
It sounds to me like the objective is they're trying to get him to snap. Like, you hear the lady on that clip, "You're snapping, JP. I mean, you're cracking, JP," or whatever it was she said. I mean, kind of taunting him, trying to get him to take the bait. And I think he did take the bait in this situation just by engaging. I mean, apparently he was just driving by the church and saw some people and decided, well, I'm going to get out and have a conversation with these folks. I don't know what he thought was going to happen there. I mean, stupid for getting out of the car in the first place. But yeah, I think they're playing a dangerous game here. And Jen, I agree with you completely about get the protest back to what it was originally about, which was the life of Micah Miller and what, they believe laws need to change in South Carolina to keep what happened to Micah Miller from happening to others. And that's a debate we need to have. I don't think it's served by people engaging in what Callie, I think if you laid out that definition, it sounds like they're engaging in harassment, not necessarily protesting at this point. But I want to shift gears a little bit here as we talk about this story. We had a guest on this week. The three of us had a great conversation with him, somebody who's done a lot of really good work on this story, Robbie Harvey. And we asked Robbie where he thought this story was going. And Callie and Jim, we've got a clip from that interview, I believe.
We do.
Let's run that real quick.
This story has turned into I could get a phone call at 3 a.m. You truly have no clue what's next. This has been, I don't know how long the documentary is going to be, but it's going to be long. And I don't know what's next. I think as far as the FBI, we obviously know that's going to take time, but I just don't know what's next. I have a genuine fear for people's safety now. I'm shocked that John Paul has not done this to the wrong one, if you know what I mean. I'm just stunned. And we're now getting to a dangerous level where people will not hesitate to defend themselves, or John Paul may get to a level And that's that. I hope it does not get to that level. I hope both sides, even John Paul, take a step back, just relax. I understand, and let's just let it play out. But obviously, that's not been the case.
Well, Callie and Jen, just amazing work on this story. It continues to advance on multiple fronts. Count on FITSNews to follow all of these new developments in the Micah Miller saga. Also, by the way, that interview with Regina Ward is up on our YouTube page. You can check that out. And the roundtable that we held with Robbie Harvey, we'll be dropping that early next week. The full discussion of where this case stands and where it's headed. For the latest on all of it, keep it tuned to FITSNews. Folks, that is a wrap for this week's edition of Your Week in Review. I want to thank everybody for tuning in. Just a huge week on so many fronts with the presidential election, with the J.P. Miller updates, just a ton of news, and we covered it all on FITSNews.com. That reminds me, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing to FITSNews.com. It's $8 a month, and your subscription empowers all that we do. Speaking truth to power, holding folks accountable. We will catch you next time on another edition of The Week in Review.